Hi, Mage fans. This is your host, Terry Robinson with Mage the Podcast. And joining me today is Jordan Etherington. You may remember Jordan from our discussion of Mage and Affect Theory. And we are doing something equally light and breezy, and that is the nature of conspiracy within the world of darkness. Jordan is a PhD candidate with a background in investigating conspiratorial thinking. If you're curious, look him up on our Discord as Lopsubdoy. And Jordan will be glad to discuss to you about the contemporary state of Canadian academics, about those and other topics. Jordan, how you doing?
I'm doing well. I'm just sitting outside. It's nice and sunny. We finally got some good weather for March, which is good. And I'm eager to start digging into this.
So let's dig. This episode is kind of in three parts. We have some information about how conspiracies work. We have some information about how they can work in games, as well as some mage-specific conspiracies, some that already exist, others that we're going to add. So, easy one, what is a conspiracy? And importantly, what is a grand conspiracy?
Thanks, Terry. I think that's like a really important question because a lot of times in pop culture, when we talk about conspiracies, like with a capital C, they're in many ways sort of the opposite of the conspiracies that really happen in our lives. So, like the definition of a conspiracy is simply a secret plan or agreement between people for an unlawful or harmful purpose, such as murder, treason, or corruption, especially with political motivation. Theoretically, any crime that has been discussed and planned in secret is a conspiracy. So, the way that real life conspiracies work then are in many ways sort of the opposite of what we're going to call grand conspiracies, just for sort of convenience. So, that is to say that they're formed for a specific action. They want to exist for as short a time as possible, include as few people as possible, and then disperse when the action is completed. So a conspiracy is formed to do something and then end. The more people that are in on it, and the longer that you're connected with the other co-conspirators, the easier it is to get caught.
Yeah, every conspiracy is a time bomb in some way, shape, or form. And the question is, can you conspire before the bomb goes off? If you and I are breaking into a bank vault and we have an inside person who's going to give us access to it, we want the distance between us starting it and us finishing it to be as short as humanly possible.
And you want it like the thing to be as specific as possible. You don't want to give anyone any more information than they absolutely need, and you don't want to know anything else than you absolutely need.
And we have a bunch of examples of these conspiracies in the world of darkness. A bunch in Mage. Hallel betraying the nascent March of the Nine to the Order of Reason. It was secret. Hallel didn't tell anyone besides the Order. He's not like, hey guys, guess what's happening next Tuesday? It was unlawful, what for the treason and the murder part, and it was for political ends. But in this case, it was for Hallel to unite the traditions in hating him, hopefully to properly unite the squabbling traditions, hating them. Didn't work out as planned.
Mages are like academics. You can't stop squabbling them. Can't stop them from squabbling.
Fighting is vicious because the stakes are so small. Reality. The concealment of the crimes of the consanguinity of eternal joy. So the House of Helikar, led by Vormas, Grand Harvester of Souls, is running around the world, sucking up quintessence from tainted nodes and doing all sorts of bad things. The Order of Hermes and the elder members of the Euthanatoi conceal all the bad stuff that's happening. I don't think we ever get like a real good explanation as to why that I was able to find.
He just kind of disappears and then he comes back as like the final boss, as your final JRPG boss.
Yes. This is revealed by Mark Edward Gillen, who, depending on how you interpret the book, Ascension, may or may not be one of Hallel's kids, and they kind of freeze him out to prevent this information from spreading. Another simple one is when the Euthanatoi kill off the Janissaries, where they're just like, doop-de-doo, don't look at this, we're just going to destroy these interlopers. So that is legal in that they circumvent tradition law in doing that and try and get away with it in time. In other games, we have the Feast of Famine, we have the Conspiracy of Isaac within Vampire, when Augustus Giovanni tries to take out Cappadocius? Or is that Salubri? Yeah, tries to take out Cappadocius.
Not Cappadocius. I mean, vampires just live and breathe conspiracy.
Yeah, they're basically conspiracies in a blood sack.
There's some crossover with Werewolf, where there's the Special Projects division with Pentex and the Syndicate. And in that case, while it is long term, like the concealing of what's happening with the Special Projects division with Pentex from the rest of the Technocratic Union, it's clear that it's a holding action. The Syndicate are trying to desperately keep this thing secret while they figure out what to do about it. There's an action that they're doing, and they want as few people in on it as possible.
And kind of like Threat Null, it's almost not a conspiracy in that it doesn't have that like evil intent. It's like, oh crap, oh crap, oh crap, oh crap, oh crap, necessarily.
Yeah, no,
there's any number of tales of something got out of control and people are trying to keep it under wraps before it spreads widely.
Yeah, and then it becomes how far do you go to keep it under wraps?
Which we'll get back to later. So talking about grand conspiracies, do we have any of those in the world of darkness?
Oh my god, do we? Theoretically, it's much easier to have a grand conspiracy in the world of darkness. So there's a lot more. We will talk more about that later. But just off the top of my head, there's the Camarilla, the Technocratic Union, the various satanic cults during the Satanic Panic that's also in World of Darkness, from Nefandus, there's Pentex, the Sabbat, the various parts of it, the Orphic Circle. There's just so many super ancient conspiracies that I'm shocked that I don't belong to one.
The question is, what are things that are not, for instance, conspiracies? Is the hierarchy a conspiracy? Is the Garou nation as a whole a conspiracy?
I would say no. The hierarchy and the Garou nation are not conspiracies in that, first of all, they're not. Well, the hierarchy isn't necessarily trying to be hidden. It's trying to necessarily keep away from living humans, but it's not that kind of thing. They don't really control that much. The Garou nation certainly doesn't control much of society, and that's a big, huge part of Grand Conspiracy, the idea of these wide-ranging and ultra-powerful global groups that have their fingers in various socio-cultural events, whereas the technocracy, for example, definitely does.
Things that are not grand conspiracies in this case is going to be not political movements. Anyone who is just kind of agitating for change, we're not going to consider that to be a grand conspiracy, even if they're comparatively large. And I imagine there's kind of a scale requirement. Children of Knowledge, for instance, not a grand conspiracy in that there are a half dozen of them. So making them one of the largest factions in my World of Darkness. That is a joke about how few mages I have in my games.
You could argue that the traditions themselves aren't grand conspiracies either, because I think, for one thing, is that a lot of them do not want to be secret. I think a lot of parts of the traditions would gladly be very open about what they are, except for if it weren't for Paradox and the stomping down on them.
Yeah, secrecy is more of a failure of marketing than anything else. So we've talked a little bit about conspiracies and grand conspiracies, and we'll kind of get a formal definition shortly. But kind of where your expertise comes in that there is a certain mindset that is prepared to find and seek out grand conspiracies. What is the state of that research, or kind of what kind of person is seemingly attracted to that?
So an interesting thing about these sort of grand conspiracies is that a lot of them, rather than looking for a definition of actual conspiracies, because these grand conspiracies generally don't exist, it's more about people who believe them or go looking for them or are attracted to sort of the idea of it. It's actually more like a faith than a science. I like the use of Barkun's 3 main principles for kind of the conspiracy mindset. This is a mindset that believes that nothing happens by accident, everything is connected, and nothing is as it seems. Now, obviously, there's a whole lot more stuff that goes in there, but broadly speaking, that's sort of the mindset of it. And it fits the World of Darkness to a T.
In fact, I would argue that in some cases it fits it too well. So the 3 things when you listed those is, it feels to me like a person inclined towards grand conspiracy will see the world as having intention, interconnection, and illusion. The 3 eyes of grand conspiracy.
So anyone with correspondence.
Exactly. And you bring up a valid point. There are paradigmic interpretations that are really close to this. Creation is divine and alive. It gives agencies to all things. A clockwork cosmos does not allow for accidents. Everything is connected, connects everything. And I like that the idea that there may be mages that just think that technocracy and traditions are just a front before some great set of masters, the Celestial Imperium or something, in the same way that...
the 10th sphere. It all grows up into the 10th sphere,
Let's talk about what are the requirements of a grand conspiracy, or what are some of the general attributes to what is often called a grand conspiracy?
A lot of these are kind of more about vibes. You know me, I like my affect theory. So life's more about vibes, but I think that it's helpful for writing if you're going to write a conspiracy because it's fun. They're fun. For this is from Baden and Sharon, 2021. One, they're unfalsifiable. So any evidence against their existence is converted to evidence for it. Of course, you're not going to find any proof that the syndicate was behind the 2008 financial collapse because they never let that happen, let that show up. They would require impossibly thorough information and social control. They would have unrealistically high membership while remaining secret, unrealistic logistical and political power, a demonstration of control over events, and the ability to act with unrealistic levels of competence, a morally binary force. So the conspiracy is either completely evil or completely good, and a vague, broadly defined objective and timeline, which is weird because the Technocratic Union actually fails a number of these standards.
I like the idea, though, that there are a lot of groups that look at this, and in the same way, like, some people look at the, this is what the 1% are like, and are like, I want to be that. There are people who look at the list of requirements for a grand conspiracy and are like, we're going to get there, boys, as they all stand in their secret.
A lot of it is projection.
Yeah.
A lot of people shouting against these conspiracies also kind of wish that they could do that to their enemies.
Yeah. The one I always find interesting is you have to be competent enough to hide yourselves from everyone except for the chosen few that have been able to pierce the conspiracy.
Yes.
And it seems like every grand conspiracy in the world of darkness often does kind of pursue these various parts, but doesn't quite have them. Like, part of the terror of the Nefandi is that they do seem to be everywhere, and the technocracy does seem to be preternaturally competent, and they do have the ability to produce unfalsifiable information that is actually a lead. Like, only the technocracy would be able to clear out that entire warehouse full of strange machinery in 2 hours between you discovering it and you coming back with the rest of your chantry.
Yeah, to a sleeper or like really like or a vampire, like someone outside of it. Like, yeah, the technocracy absolutely seems like this completely monolithic outside binary force. But interesting, like, yeah, once you get in there, it's like, oh my God, they're arguing with each other constantly.
Yeah.
Oh my God, they need a cleanup crew for the cleanup crew, you know?
We cannot reliably get non-dairy creamer in the break room, and you think we're controlling the UN? No, that's not how this works.
The syndicate might have caused the 2008 financial collapse by accident. It was a huge problem.
Yeah, that was an oopsie, not a look what we can do. So whenever I think about conspiracy theories, almost all of them invariably turn into anti-Semitism, or they started in anti-Semitism. And as a general idea, that's something that we want to avoid. What are some recommendations on how to avoid that, either when researching or coming up with a grand conspiracy, Jordan?
I would make it not identity-based, based on these sort of common social cleavages. So, don't make it so the conspiracy only brings in, people from the Middle East. Don't make it so it's like it's only women or it's only Christians or something like that. Or obviously only Jewish people. I also think an important thing is to try to make it something that people could or would reasonably join, even if they don't really know what the conspiracy wants. So, like, don't include the mindless grunts in there. And I say that because a lot of sort of the anti-Semitism of a lot of these real world conspiracy theories is sort of this idea that the sort of elite masters, I'm not going to use the terms that they use for it. These elite masters are actually like puppet mastering these less intelligent demographics to their tune, and only these noble other racism stuff will be able to fight against it.
Yeah, a lot of it does ultimately reduce to an idea that
the other.
Yeah, there is an other that has a set of attributes that allows them to excel or control, but for bad reasons or towards bad ends. And we have a different set of attributes, or are in some way chosen, and only we may oppose it.
Yeah. Or they may not even actually be able to control. Like, like if you were to, God forbid, bring up like these ideas around, Jewish bankers or something, like there's probably significantly more Christian bankers who are very wealthy than Jewish bankers.
Yeah, the base rate problem very quickly asserts itself when you talk about that, in the same way that I was trying to figure out. I did a survey a couple years ago of like World of Darkness gaming, and the overwhelming conclusion I came to is most people play vampire and happen to play another game. Like the number of people who of vampire players who also happen to play mage is like 4 times the size of mage players. So if we look at the overall
Which is
World of
very
Darkness
interesting.
yeah, if you look at the overall World of Darkness community, like a lot of the ties purportedly between game lines are a little bit facile. But yeah, I was thinking through these and I was thinking about like maybe
Yeah.
there's a bunch of people who are trying to summon Pia, Returner of the Morn, and it is composed of everyone who has ever lost a loved one. The Fellowship and the Axe and Saw wants to see more wild Gorgons running around and is a cross section of hunters, eco-terrorists, druids, preppers, and such. To answer the grunt question, there may be multiple levels of membership within this organization. If someone is doing grunt work, it's probably because they think they can get access to the ruby of Hamesh that grants true third sight, or they get to learn the secrets of serenoscopy to predict the future from lightning, or that they will eventually meet the August Master who grants all wisdom. So if someone is a frontline grunt, they are either new, or alternatively, they are doing it as kind of like I like the idea that within the World of Darkness, there's like an Uber for henchmen, where you're like, hey, we need a few extra people tonight.
Hi, goons.
Yeah, exactly.
They don't have the personal touch you get with hired goons.
Yeah.
I also like the idea of entry level. Maybe they just join an entry level one because it gives them business connections or something. I like the idea of this sort of super high stakes conspiracy stuff tied to very petty reasons.
Very basic reasons. I mean, within both the Syndicate tradition convention book, and within the Book of the Fallen, it's like it's amazing what darkness people will do for a steady job that includes dental benefits.
I got control over all the media on the Eastern Seaboard because there was this girl I like
Yeah.
and I wanted to impress her. And then it just kind of snowballed, and now here I am.
You also have another piece of advice about making conspiracies or grand conspiracies more interesting. What was that?
I think it's important to give the conspiracy a motivation and making it do specific things just being a static force. Like you see this idea of like, oh, the satanic, if you're deep into those sort of conspiracy spaces, just like, oh, there's this satanic cabal that does everything that you don't like, even the things that seem to contradict each other. And the thing is that if you're making conspiracy that does everything, it essentially does nothing because there's no difference between it not moving and it moving. It's more interesting if it is like they're trying to find this specific, maybe massive, like goal, like the idea with the Giovanni wanting to destroy the shroud between worlds. And how are they doing that? They're stealing souls. Like that's an interesting thing that you can start from a base of there's a vampire stealing souls from some people. You have someone with entropy. They're freaked out about this. And you can work that way up until like you're at this massive level, right?
And one of the ways I like working something like this into a game is the idea of agendas, which I steal from Delta Green. And with an agenda, there's generally 4 stages at which the players or characters are alerted to what's going on. And in the first level is usually a low level informational thing or a background thing. The second one is something that kind of more directly affects the operations of the characters. Mages have a lot of early warning systems for kind of grand conspiracies. You learn about the conspiracy before they learn about you, which gives you the opportunity to move. I never kind of like when the bad guy gets the drop in a lot of cases because I frequently find that causes players to freeze. Some groups like that, I haven't had one that did yet.
I think it can be very interesting if you do it with great care and finesse. Like the idea, it's like, oh, we learned something that seems very mundane, and suddenly, like, these people are going after us because of something that we have, like, it's just some like receipt from like a gas station. And then it's like it kind of gives your players like just something about this receipt that's really important. Try to keep the conspiracies around people and humans and human motivations to keep that because you also have people talking it's like oh this ethnicity is actually part alien, this ethnicity is being controlled by reptilians or something, right? And I think it's important to step away from sort of this the non-human. I'm using like big quotes, like I consider Garu to still be human, for example, where you want to have these understandable reasons behind things because first it's good to keep from getting into these really un, uncomfortable and sort of implications, but also because there's a saying I have with my gaming group when we were talking about Call of Cthulhu, where I said like the least interesting thing that Cthulhu can ever do is wake up. Because after Cthulhu wakes up, like you can't, there's no intrigue there. There's nothing. The game's either over or there's a kaiju. Whereas if you have this people leading it, even if you do have some kind of, elder god in the background, like then you can have like conversations with them. You can have backstabbing, you can have intrigue, you can have all this stuff that makes these interesting.
If the grand reveal for the grand conspiracy is something like Cthulhu waking up, your group has to succeed, which is, it does kind of create excitement, but like you can't fail. And it really depends on the nature of the game. Like, if you're playing an action adventure game, your group's probably going to succeed. The question then becomes at what cost. If it's a World of Darkness game, depending on the tone you've set, like you almost already know the answer of that. And that to me is also uninteresting. Where if it's a much lower stake thing where the group is merely trying to break the third seal holding Cthulhu, it can go either way. And that to me is a bit more interesting. And I mean, the glory of mages, we often have early warning systems for all this weird stuff.
Yes.
Your chantry node starts to sputter, which alerts you to a change in building construction in the area that is kind of messing with ley lines around it. Whenever you step into the penumbra, it's always the Vidare Mortuum for some reason, as if someone is meddling with the shroud. Spirit summoning changes in terms of times or difficulty, or certain types of magic are more difficult to use. And this kind of gives you an idea of like, well, what's going around or out there.
Yeah, something's going on.
Anything we want to talk about before we go over just some common conspiracies and grand conspiracies that can be included in a game?
Make sure that the conspiracy is thematically and sort of like spatially located in a way that your group will care about. Like if your conspiracy is just there's a lot of rich people out there trying to make money for themselves, it's like that's not a conspiracy, we know.
Yeah. Yeah. And that can still be something your game fights against. We don't need the cladding of
spice.
Yeah, we don't need necessarily that cladding. I was kind of looking through and trying to figure out like what are the most common conspiracies that one encounters in urban fantasy games. And it kind of broke down into 8 or 9 different classes, and some of them don't really fit for mage, but these are kind of the ones that I found. One was the idea of ancient secret societies, sometimes referred to as a cabal, a term I generally try not to use, that are manipulating world events from behind the scenes. These groups often have their own agendas, whether it's seeking ultimate power, uncovering forbidden knowledge, or controlling the fate of nations. This is your technocracy or your camarilla. Yeah. The key thing is that they are old, and they are not formally in power in a lot of cases. Their members may have significant personal power, and they pool that to achieve an end. But this is different than calling the U.S. Senate a conspiracy.
And I think that the Camarilla, for example, is a really good example of that sort of connecting pettiness to this huge stakes, where a lot of the Camarilla and like these power plays they go on seem to be towards an ultimate end, but a lot of them are just really old vampires trying to either find something interesting to do after their minds have decayed after thousands of years, or just petty power plays against someone that snubbed them a week ago.
Yeah, I'm trying to take over Alberta, not because I have a particular concern with Alberta, but because I'm trying to spite a friend of mine or somebody that snubbed me 2,000 years ago for a dinner party invite.
Then you had government, so conspiracies involving government agencies or shadowy organizations covering up the existence of supernatural phenomena, extraterrestrial beings, or otherworldly threats. These cover ups typically involve suppressing information, silencing witnesses, and engaging in clandestine operations to maintain control. So this is interesting because I think this is the closest to small c conspiracies. I think the difference is that like when they become grand conspiracies, when you have this like entire apparatus around maintaining this cover up. And I don't know, there's something kind of darkly funny about that too.
And the question always becomes, why is this being covered up? So, for instance, throughout the history of vampire, that is generally where we get the most information about government groups trying to do this. We get the Special Affairs Division, which is small and underfunded and kind of knows the capital T truth, but for whatever reason is co-opted or prevented from sharing it. And then you get into Hunter 5th edition, And governments know about the supernatural, but people see it as another opportunity to increase their authoritarian power and budget. Like, the
Yeah.
bigger this vampire threat is, the more people with automatic weapons I can have mobilized as part of my special military strike force. So my goal is to play up this threat internally as much as possible and to prevent other people from seeing it, because the moment the public sees it and knows what's going on, they're going to ask, why wasn't I protected from this before? Or why didn't you take care of this? And then I'm going to lose status in my organization for failing it. So it's an interesting fine line. And Hunter 5th edition, consult the episodes on that, goes through 5 or 6 different government organizations. Yeah. Within other games, you have Delta Green itself, and then you have Project Majestic and so on. And you mentioned that one of the things about a grand conspiracy is that they tend to be categorically good or evil. This is one where you can attempt to make a categorically good one, notionally, even if you don't agree with their morality. In their minds, they are doing it for the benefit of the public.
There's also interesting things to say about bureaucracies, like intrinsically trying to expand. So there's this sort of funny idea of like, oh, we have the SAD, and it started out as just like a couple underfunded people in a single office, and then it's just grown and grown and grown until it's become this sort of weird tumor, like in the government.
Yep. Within a bureaucracy, there are always 2 groups of people. This is, I think, Purnell's law. Those who are trying to accomplish the mission of the bureaucracy and those who are trying to expand their bureaucratic power. And over time, the second group will always win.
Yes.
Or at least that's what Jerry Purnell said. Kind of the third class we have are corporate conspiracies. These are mega corporations or conglomerates engaging in unethical or supernatural practices for profit or power. These corporations may be involved in secret research, manipulating markets, exploiting supernatural forces for their own gain, often at the expense of humanity or the environment. Any number of syndicate front companies count for this. Project Orpheus is certainly a conspiracy in that what they are doing is secret and they're doing it for their own benefit.
Were they secret? I thought they were like trying to sell it to people.
They're trying to sell it to people, but I got the sense from reading it that what's actually the way they're doing it is kind of the secret sauce. But yeah,
right.
A public-private conspiracy. Pentax is a big example of this. I don't speak Pentax. Jordan, what is Pentax and what are they trying to do?
Oh, Pentax is like the big Captain Planet villain in the world of darkness for like werewolf. It is this massive megacore like folding company that basically is run by people who worship the worm. And they try to and they're super wealthy and powerful, and they also try to cause as much environmental devastation as possible for various reasons, whether it's out of sheer negligence or maybe it's required to do it as part of their pact with the worm, who's the embodiment of entropy. This could be going way off into the weeds. The conspiracy there is that it is run by a group of eldritch abomination worshippers. So fit that right into a lot of conspiracies in real life. Yeah. And they got their kind of fingers in every pie and that kind of thing.
And kind of the key thing from what I understand is no one owns shares in Pentax. Like, Pentax itself is not a public company.
No.
They own controlling stakes in a lot of companies. You may own shares in some companies they own. Others are going to be wholly private. And as you mentioned,
There's no Pentax letterhead.
Yeah.
For example.
The Pentax board is quite small. But it is this weird place where the worm does business, and anything sufficiently powerful is going to have its own internal factions. So it's not even like the top of Pentax is neatly unified. And I wouldn't be surprised if the worm itself is interested in seeing fighting within its own ranks, assuming it doesn't get in the way too much. But I think Pentax is on the radar for something that we should do kind of an episode on at some point.
It's also interesting when you talk about corporate conspiracies because that kind of a lot of these categories can very easily overlap with each other. Like a government cover up with corporate conspiracies got like military industrial complex stuff. You've got stuff like the Orpheus project. If you probably could get some government money in there wanting to be like, let's weaponize ghosts.
In one of the Wraith books, that there is a energy company that is trying to figure out how to turn Wraiths into power, possibly turn Pathos into explosives or something like that. What else we got?
Oh, we got alien invasions. Conspiracies revolve around the presence of extraterrestrial beings secretly infiltrating Earth or manipulating human society for their own purposes. These aliens may have hidden agendas ranging from colonization to experimentation on human subjects. So this is like an old favorite, right? It's sort of like either aliens are coming or you're sort of out group that this kind of conspiracy theory is really trying to defame is working for the aliens, or maybe they're part aliens. I think you could fold reptilians in with this too.
This is one of those things that kind of goes from it's not just humans, there's also this other thing out there. And Aliens Within the World of Darkness is a fascinating subject in that it's one of the few things that I think has really done a good job of kind of riding the line of what's actually going on for a pretty long period of time without anyone accidentally giving a canon answer. We've done episodes on the Kaluan, on the Zigrogler, any number of weird alien type things, the Sea Maleficaris of the Umbra, and so on. And this is something that works
Do the
both.
Fondi worship aliens, or do they worship Cthulhu's? Like all
Yeah.
that kind of stuff. Yeah.
And this is one that kind of cuts both ways, where it's they're out there and they are doing things and the government is covering it up to prevent a freak out or to prevent the aliens from revealing themselves and taking over everyone. Or, a la the X-Files continuity, the Syndicate is in cahoots with the aliens to kind of save their own hide. It could be used as a cover for other operations where the technocracy is doing some sort of weird thing, or the Nefandi are summoning deep umbral craft to sacrifice to their dark lords, and the technocracy is like, we can't explain to people that Satan worshippers have access to sky cars, but you know what's in the zeitgeist? UFOs. So this can go in a whole bunch of directions.
Also, like, say if you get like kidnapped by a fae, or you get juice boxed by a vampire, or something like that, or attacked by a werewolf, like, what are you most likely in the current zeitgeist going to think? A vampire bit me, or I got probed by an alien. Like, you got cattle mutilation right there.
Yeah. And I think it's kind of interesting. You bring up that question now. What I would say, I would probably, commentary on where I live is I would probably say, oh, there's a new street drug, or you got hit by airborne fentanyl. And then suddenly all this supernatural activity is being used as a justification to increase the DEA budget, or for the local constabulary to try and double or triple their amount of staffing to try and deal with it. And then we, as always, we have that question of, you can take advantage of people's fear until they believe that you are ineffectual, and then they will turn
Yeah.
on you.
But yeah, I do like the idea because I think interesting, like when reading folklore, a lot of these sort of alien abduction stories seem to have feel a lot like much older stories about like encounters with fair folk and stuff. You know, you fall asleep in a forest and then you wake up and it's like 100 years have gone by, but only 10 for you,
Yeah.
missing time and all that.
The authors in Mage, when they introduced the Zigrogler, were looking for, and the Kalawan were looking for a way to update those kind of changeling stories. The next one for me are kind of apocalyptic cults, which I think has a weird collection of members if we look at it in a certain way.
Mhm.
These are culture secret societies dedicated to bringing about the end of the world or ushering in a new age of enlightenment through ritualistic practices, ancient prophecies, or summoning dark entities. These cults may seek to awaken ancient gods, unleash cosmic horrors, or trigger cataclysmic events. This includes the traditions, depending on how you interpret Ascension.
Yeah, an apocalypse isn't necessarily like the destruction of the world. It's supposed to be sort of like
Yeah,
it means like
apocalypse.
unveiling or something, doesn't
Yes,
it?
a not or to undo. Poco meaning to conceal. So a sudden revealing.
Yeah, like in some all these cults in the world of darkness, for example, aren't really for the apocalypse. Like the Sabbat are not a fan of the antediluvians. The traditions definitely want to keep their world.
But they think it will be fundamentally transformed. The Sabbat believes that
Yes,
one
they
day
want.
the antediluvians will rise, Cain will return, and they will be Cain's army. Yeah, if you're in a group that believes in mass ascension, that is kind of one of these
Yeah,
cataclysmic events that will suddenly see the change of things.
the revolutionary communist group could, in some respects, if you get like really out there with it, could also be seen as like apocalyptic in some way.
Yeah,
For example.
that there will be a sudden change. Life will be suddenly different in a way different from previous types of changes. Any other basic themes or basic types?
Oh, I mean, I think an interesting thing is sort of this idea of inevitability for a lot of them. Like a lot of the groups aren't necessarily trying to usher it in, but are just believe that it's going to happen and they're about being prepared for it, which lends it some an interesting sort of, I think, an interesting amount of like kind of faith and desperation when you meet people from that cult, because to them, like what they're doing, it's like they're just could just be trying to like get things ready for it. If you stop me, you're not going to stop what's really coming, for
Yeah.
example.
And you want to join me so that when the bad thing happens, you will be part of the few, the chosen, the prepared that will be able to do it. And it also has a built-in answer of saying, hey, yes, I am asking you to give up these things to start your doomsday prepping or what have you. But it turns out those things aren't really important.
Oh, it's like you want to be eaten last. You want to be one of the people to be eaten last.
Yeah. And there's any number of games that kind of have that premise where victory is merely losing the least. So I did the exercise of looking for some grand conspiracies that I thought were interesting and saying, what could we do with those in the world of darkness? Jordan, are you familiar with the Phantom Time conspiracy?
Oh, I am. I've heard a few different versions. I've heard some where it's like actually the Russians did everything. I've heard others where because of the change in dating style, like dating format, it was used to cover up a few hundred years.
Yep. So, time conspiracies are a class of conspiracies that basically say calendar that we use has a gap or a hole or a jump in it that is in some way important and influential. And the one I'm going to run with is the idea that the years CE 614 to 911 were fabricated by the Holy Roman Emperor Otto III, Pope Sylvester II, and the Byzantine Emperor Constantine VII, among others, to position the start of their reigns around the year 1000. Proponents of this theory argue that these rulers have manipulated historical records, they forged documents, and they altered calendars to create the illusion of an additional 297 years of history. This extended their own reigns, legitimized their authority, allowed them to tie interesting things to the year 1000. There's just one problem. These groups did not control the entirety of the world's dating systems. So, for instance, the calendars of the Mesoamericans have no such gaps. But the idea was that this would explain why, specifically in England, when this research was being done, there weren't a lot of artifacts from the 7th, 8th, and ninth centuries CE. So I don't know why the immediate thing you jump to is several centuries disappeared. So my thought with this is actually the plans of a group of time-traveling hermetics who need to keep an entity of malevolent time from the shard realm of time from entering reality. This coincides with the founding of the Order of Hermes that was created to assemble and destroy this being. This resulted in the destruction of the city of Pymander, but secured the rest of the space-time continuum. So the Hermetics are actually the real heroes in that they destroyed their ultimate goal to prevent this time entity from getting out. And now the funny part is the technocracy knows that in the year 2049, a mortal is going to discover, a sleeper is going to discover time travel, creating a similar issue. But the Hermetics are afraid that they'll break the time seal in doing so, resulting in this mystic versus techno-magic cross-time war.
I feel like I'm going to need like a conspiracy board for that.
There's going to need to be a board on this. And Jordan mentioned other phantom time conspiracies. There is something foundational in modern society about time as a unit of control, and anyone who seeks to change it, it is a overtly political and philosophical act in addition to it being a logistical one. Just let's all set our watches to the same time.
By the standards of most human history, like we are weirdly obsessive about time. Like the idea of dividing time into specific minutes, you have to be here by this time, would probably be seen as like ridiculous if you went, back a few centuries. Chemtrails is a fun one.
What are chemtrails?
Chemtrails are what they call basically like aircraft exhaust comes out.
Contrails. Yeah. It is not exhaust. It is a surprisingly complicated set of phenomena that I tried to precisely explain to someone. And in the process of doing it and being like, oh, it requires air of this type and a tail tip of this angle, and you need to be at this height to create it. And it was one of those things where I'm like, no, chemtrails, now I understand why this is the simpler explanation. But you'll sometimes see it that there will be a vessel in the sky, it crosses, and there's a nice line of what appears to be cloud coming out behind it. And
the actual conspiracy is that's how clouds are made.
Yeah, that's how clouds are born. That's how we've been doing it since time immemorial. Yeah. But what is generally the conspiratorial take on this? Yeah.
The idea is that, speaking seriously now, some believe that those chemtrails are have sinister intent and that they are spraying chemicals to enter the atmosphere for various nefarious reasons, mind control, diseases, fertility, really anything, like anything that you could imagine that could be changed by it. You'll probably have some weather control.
Yeah, that's a pretty common one. And just to note, the actual phenomenon is a jet contrail. The conspiracy are chemtrails. So just to differentiate. Now, sometimes vessels do things such as cloud seeding or crop dusting or pesticide spraying, but generally that's done under very specific circumstances, either higher or lower in terms of the atmosphere.
And it's very hard to secretly do that as well.
Yeah. And it's also a modern phenomenon. Like prior to the de Havilland Comet, we didn't have that, which gave me the idea that the de Havilland Comet was invented by the Society of Ether to fend off the Yttrian sky spore. People got used to seeing these trails, so now it needs to be maintained. Other people are going to go, hey, how come planes don't leave trails anymore? Now, normally it's just water, but some infernalists, controlled by a few samples of the Yttrian sky spore, are looking to reveal the hoax. That way, Etherites lose the ability to seed the sky to prevent their atmospheric invasion.
I like that it's infernalists doing it. Like, it has nothing to do with hell. It's just they happen to get it.
Yep.
It happens.
It seems like a convenient group to co-op.
You got your Kalasha stuck in my infernalist.
Yeah.
Oh, not bad.
What about that? What are we going to do here? One that I find endlessly fascinating is what's often referred to as the Mandela effect. These are specific false memories that can sometimes be shared by a large group of people. It was dubbed the Mandela effect by the paranormal researcher Fiona Broom, who reported having vivid and detailed memories of news coverage of South African apartheid leader Nelson Mandela dying in prison in the 1980s, despite Mandela dying in 2013, decades after serving as a political prisoner and also serving as the president of South Africa from 1994 to 1999.
Yeah. And having an extremely public life and continuing to be active in political movements and everything afterwards as well until his death.
Yeah, and this was used as proof of parallel worlds and that they kind of slip into each other sometimes. The fact that it's the Berenstain Bears instead of the Berenstein Bears, the fact that the Fruit of the Loom logo does not have a cornucopia on it, the fact that no one is familiar with how to spell Fruit Loop. There's also one that
I liked the one that I heard first was this belief that Sinbad was in the movie Shazam instead of Shaquille O'Neal, the actual movie, which is Shaquille O'Neal in Kazam.
One of the ones that I thought was also interesting is, I think it was during the bombing of Sarajevo or something like that, there was a notable clock that everyone thought had stopped and that clock has not functioned since that bombing, when it was actually repaired later that day.
This one's very funny to me because it's just like you just remembered something wrong, and why you got to make it a whole thing?
Again, because as we talk about conspiracies, a lot of them play into basic concerns that we have. Like you mentioned about chemtrails, the idea of fertility, that they're controlling our population through our ability to breed, and you're attacking my sense of virility. Here, it's attacking the notion of memory, which, as you and I were talking about earlier, it's hard to separate that from a sense of mortality, that I cannot even trust the witness I have of my own life. I like the idea that these are actually examples of widespread paradox backlashes, and paradox spirits use them to track down archmasters using their reality-defining powers. So every time a new one pops up, there is a group of paradox spirits who are like, get on it, boys! And it's kind of this weird...
Or any given marauder.
Yeah, or this is a sign of a marauder of a certain level of quiet has fallen through reality and needs to be contained. I like the idea that this is a place where an Everett volume has come through. They get larger over time, and a community of mortal Oniromancers need to investigate it. But I think we can have fun with a lot of these in games. The one thing I will note is that conspiracy and grand conspiracies do vary around the world in terms of what people count. I was looking for examples from around the world, and one that popped up was the common idea of mass medical experimentation in sub-Saharan Africa. And this one's an interesting one because there have been a number of cases where Western pharmaceutical companies have done questionable medical tests in other countries.
It's a huge problem.
With questionable human rights records, and especially around the idea of informed consent. Have you adequately conveyed to someone what they are signing up for? For instance, Pfizer had a antibiotic, Trovan, I believe, who did trials in Nigeria, and it turned out that the government documentation that it had been approved had been falsified. There was ultimately a settlement.
Yeah.
So again, the claim of conspiracy can also be used to dismiss true things that have occurred, or there is something like a kernel of truth to it. So when picking a conspiracy, try and be mindful of that.
I think an interesting way to like divide it, because like this is a thing that happened and it's had, these and similar things have had significant issues, like especially with, picking up vaccinations in sub-Saharan Africa, like vaccine hesitancy in sub-Saharan Africa, because they have proof they can look at to be like, why should I trust these people? These grand conspiracies tend to involve looking much deeper than you really need to for motivations, whereas where this one was neglect and like not really doing due diligence about these people, because they're kind of using them as guinea pigs for medicine that's going to be used, that they hope to use in the West and in more, affluent countries. There's no need to insert some kind of, oh, they're actually trying to insert nanomachines or like genetically alter them. Like, I think that the real story is quite enough.
And another class that I kept running into, especially in East Asia and Sub-Saharan Africa, was the idea that like former colonial powers are still controlling these nations and or states in some way. And sometimes I'm like, well, I can't really argue with some of those if this is your major supplier of certain critical pieces of infrastructure and it's being done in exchange for certain political concessions or to oppose the geopolitical movements of another group of people. So it's one of those things where it's like, is that a conspiracy or is this just business and it's ugly? That is not me saying it's a good thing.
More ugly business than a grand overarching ultra powerful conspiracy. These are matters of record often.
Yeah, and you had brought up another one in terms of conspiracy theories to kind of be concerned about, and that was ancient aliens. What do we need to avoid when we're looking into that?
Well, a lot of times with ancient aliens, they often reinforce a lot of sort of racist stereotypes about non-white people. For example, like the idea that a lot of Mesoamerican ruins are in fact signs of aliens having come and either built them or taught the people to build them, because they don't conform to often these very Eurocentric Western ideas of what they could do. When if you actually look at like the time, like I think it was, I'm sorry, I don't have the exact date. I think it was like in the 13th century, for example, like Cahokia in North America would have been a larger city than Paris at the same time. They would have come to Paris and been like, oh, this is small potatoes compared to us. But because it's sort of there's these political motivations behind it, not necessarily conscious ones, but these sort of worldviews around them, it can be easy to convince people that these people were not capable of doing the same things we could have done. Ergo, they must have had outside assistance.
Yeah, the population of Cahokia was probably somewhere in the 11th or 12th century. And the next time a city of more than 40,000 people existed, it was Philadelphia in the 1780s. So it took another 5 centuries to get back to there. I like the idea of either inverting this, saying that it was like, no, Egyptian pyramid builders were able to help aliens return.
Yes.
But they had to commit
like
such a
that.
great sacrifice to help them do it that it prevented them from us having a Egypt-dominated globe now, or the Mesoamericans had to sacrifice their sacred mathematics or had to dedicate their infrastructure towards repairing this alien spacecraft.
Oh, these bloody aliens.
Yeah.
It reminds me of one of my favorite Futurama jokes where they go to this like Egypt-themed planet. So it's like, oh, those pyramids look like the ones in Egypt. And then one goes like, yes, we learned many things from the mighty Egyptians.
I can get behind that. I would also like the idea.
I think it's a much more interesting plot line, as well as, just a way to think about things is less, oh, how could these people, like, what could have come to do this? Because this doesn't fit in with these people, as, well, what do we not know about these people? They must have been more capable than we thought. I think that's a much more fruitful and interesting line, whether you're writing a plot or.
Yeah, I feel like that's one of those things where it's like there's probably a number of cases where we could be like, yeah, it turns out this ancient people probably did have access to high explosives. It's just the fact that all the evidence of such are water soluble. and would have, in the intervening centuries, quite simply washed away. Or they were exceptionally capable of cultivating this particular seed crop, which we just assume is a weed, and we did not realize that vast areas of the Amazon basin, maybe, or something like that, or vast areas of the Sahel were actually these kind of Edenic gardens, but because of desertification, any evidence of that was just kind of destroyed over time.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's, again, it's like much more interesting and much more human to actually sort of like treat them as adults with agency and their own thoughts and stuff.
And there are a class of, I don't know if I would want to call them necessarily conspiracies, but historical anomalies where it does seem that, that this people was able to do this interesting thing. What would be the natural outgrowth of this group that you did not think could make a multi-thousand-mile oceanographic voyage doing so? Like, we know that Polynesia was populated, so like it had to have happened. What if something similar happened in other areas?
Ocean Polynesian mages making like following ley lines in the ocean, stuff like that.
Ready for
Like
cryptids?
cryptids, Mothman, hero or friend?
I find cryptids interesting in that we have talked about cryptids before, but how they interface with conspiracies, I find them to be interesting. And to me, there's a couple ways that this can always go. One is, this is kind of a tongue-in-cheek thing that's like, if cryptids were real and there was a breeding population, they would immediately in the US be protected by the Endangered Species Act. So like, there's a group of people that want the
Pentex versus Mothman.
Exactly. That like Pentex wants Mothman to stay a legend, because if it turns out that Mothman is actually part of a breeding pair, the McClintock Wildlife Management Area in West Virginia, they can no longer do logging there.
I love, again, that there's that petty thing. I love the, it's like we have to kill this legendary creature so we can drill here. There's nothing important there. We just want that oil.
Exactly. Like, I'm sorry, the abominable snowman happens to be sitting on top of a rich coal vein. I don't care about his majestic or her majestic beauty. We need to get rid of it. Remember, it has to be a breeding pair, though, because otherwise courts have frequently ruled that if there's just one, they are functionally extinct. Maybe cryptids are covers for shapeshifters to keep people from their homes. The Loveland frog is actually some sort of released giant anarid shifter, and Legends of the Loveland frog keep it away. This is a Ohio cryptid that is quite large and capable of swallowing a person. Maybe there's a secret society of big game hunters that wants to keep them all to themselves. Maybe the Fellowship of the Horn can only be joined once you've killed a Yeti. And this is this weird hermetic group that is like, we will only fight the most dangerous of things, and we can only do it with our wits' cunnings and a single very, very large Bowie knife.
We already went through man, so now we got to go higher.
Exactly. We must hunt the most dangerous game of all, werewolves.
I like the idea of Bigfoot because there's so much weird mythology around Bigfoot. Like, you would think that Bigfoot was like a Marvel character. He's got like, he can like hop dimensions. He's psychic. He can create illusions. Bigfoot is just a Neolithic time traveling mage.
Yeah.
Who's trying to get home.
Yeah. This reminds me of one of my favorite Far Side comics, where it shows two cavemen on a log, where it's like Grok test drives his greatest invention, the time log. And it just shows two cavemen on this log, like going woo over like a modern city street, and everyone like looking skyward. But yeah, I like the idea of time traveling Neolithic mages being the source of a bunch of these. I also like the idea that these cryptids are actually kind of coming in pairs. There are two Jersey Devils. One feeds on the souls of the guilty, and another one feeds off the terror of teenagers. They can't directly harm each other because they are part of the same like umbral spirit brood, but they wage this war over dominance of the last remaining coastal pine forests in America. That like one is empowered by Gaia and the other one is empowered by the worm, and they have been engaged in this Jersey Devil fight for centuries. Because that's where mine goes.
I like that.
Yeah.
That would also be why there's so many different versions of it.
Exactly. We've talked about them. We've talked about some conspiracies. What do I need to include in my game to have a conspiratorial mood?
So if you're talking about like small C or big C, I think an interesting thing is like never knowing who you can trust. And I mean, that's pretty common in World of Darkness, but I think really putting it like heavily, like really pressing it on them. Like the idea of it's like any given sleeper is not just someone who is a dupe of the technocracy, but actively reports to them. Is that a phone? That thing could be listening to me. Is that an Alexa? Well, I mean, they are listening to you, but specific people are listening to you. I try to describe it as sort of like this physical feeling of kind of like weight on you and like this feeling that it's hard to move without all of your actions and places in space being like analyzed and taken. But you have to be careful with that because again, that can cause players to freeze. You need enough so that it creates more of a roadmap to follow a plot than just this omnipresent vagueness that can make it just feel tedious and frustrating.
For me, one of the key ones is kind of to make, you made the mention of know what sleeper can you trust. Mine is to make familiar objects seem kind of suspicious. What does graffiti mean? Is it a scrying symbol? Is that just somebody being bored? Who's listening through your telephone? An issue that you'll run into, though, is in Mage is magic detection to try and pick up that bug. One of the things I have is whenever you roll to detect something, you will always find something. It may be an actual bug. It will never be a false negative. I will never tell you something that isn't listening to you that actually is. But did you just smash that TV for no reason? The symbol that kind of comes to mind in modernity is the muted post horn from the crying of Lot 49. Philadelphia has a number of old high-pressure fire plugs that were never removed. Those are the drop points for the hidden council that runs the city. I would like the idea to take your smartphone idea. I would do it the other way. I would do dumb phones. Like, oh, you're still using a Motorola Razr from 2000? That's interesting. And suddenly that is kind of your tip off, even though it's just kind of this hipster throwback thing.
An interesting sort of source for like artifacts. Like you have tradition artifacts where it's like, here's a phone that specifically cannot connect to the internet or cannot be listened in on. I think another interesting one would be like in any given city, there's just like one phone booth that's still there. And it's in a part of town that people aren't paying much attention to. So it could just as easily be like no one's gotten around to it. Or is that a teleportation situation or something?
I can't remember what city it had, but it still had a number of phone booths, and there were clear signs on it that said, yes, this phone actually works and can be used to make calls, like to clearly indicate that. And I look at that and I'm like, well, that's obviously for the conspiracy. That's pretty straightforward.
No, it's a double blind. What you're actually supposed to do is pick up a brick and talk into it.
Yeah, exactly. One of the ones that I think is interesting from actual history is the use of code words.
Ciphers.
Yeah, and ciphers and kind of identifying it. If you always think you're under surveillance, there are two ways to do it. One, you can encrypt all your communication. Two, it is not uncommon to do it double encryption, where not only do you encrypt the plain text, but the plain text has been modified, where Mark Edward Gillen never referred to the Nefandi, he just or the Euthanatoi, he always said just the staff or something like that. And that's where you get like the things like the lion and the unicorn fight for the crown or something like that, where even if you have the plain text, you're like, what the dink? And maybe your group does this internally and it can be fun to come up with a whole bunch of fake terms.
So you have a group member who's kind of not comfortable with like coming up with that stuff on the fly, for example. Like another strategy I've seen used by people who are under investigation, they know that they're being tapped or phone, is to just be incredibly non-specific. Instead of saying, hey, boss, I shot the guy over, like you said, it's just like, hey, I did the thing. Click.
The payload has been delivered. The payload in this case being a 9mm slug.
It's done.
Yep.
I think another big one is this is like I think really important for the vibe to be there is this growing alienation between the quote unquote normal world and themselves. Now, Terry, I hear you saying, this is the world of darkness. This is the world of darkness. We're already kind of in this other world. But I think creating another division in that can make you feel even more alienated. And I think that a good way to do that is also sort of externally is incentivizing the players to act in ways that externally seem very strange and off-putting to other people. You know, like the old idea of it's like tinfoil hats, so no one can hear your thoughts. And it's like other people think you're crazy. You know that they actually can hear your thoughts unless you wear those tinfoil hats. But you still see the looks other people give you, and it does still affect you emotionally.
So that's a conspiratorial mood. One of the things you brought up is the idea of conspiratorial horror as a genre. What's that?
There's like a specific sort of mode of horror where it's less about this secret monster coming to get you and more about gradually finding out that the world is much more both controlled and hostile to you than you thought. And that things that, you know, as we said before, the world isn't the way we think it is. Nothing happens by mistake and everything is connected, but it's bad for you. It's sort of like in They Live, you know, putting the glasses on and then finding out that it's like, oh, all this stuff I took for granted is actually being controlled with evil intent. And how you even begin to react to this sort of overwhelming sense of fear and despair, I guess you could say.
And what tools do we kind of have in our toolbox to build that?
Well, one thing is there's a human tendency towards something called epiphania, which is the creation of connections or patterns between random events and phenomena. A big part of the human brain is towards creating patterns. It's a huge part of how we survive. It's also what leads you to see, faces in clouds and stuff. You could use certain symbols or motifs that could lead PCs or NPCs to assume connections that may or may not exist to the point where they can feel sort of crushed by this weight of omnipresence. I remember people saying, like, say, the Starbucks logo was actually like a symbol of an evil cabal. This is very 90s, but back when Starbucks was just everywhere. I mean, it's easy to make fun of it or laugh at that, but imagine if you really believed that and you were seeing these logos pop up in your neighborhood more and more and more, and how that would feel to you.
Apophenia from the Greek, meaning to appear. Nice.
I mean, one could also say it's like, well, what about if you have correspondence? It's like, great, even more. That's your person to poke at.
Another key is kind of to draw on that contrast between how the players act versus those who are not in the know and those who purportedly are. And this gives us an interesting balance to try and maintain. So kind of then becomes where the horror characters find out that their grand act of revelation is simply a planned move by the conspiracy. You go to the local news, who immediately report it to their technocratic masters. Your YouTube video is immediately buried. So the horror is in the fact that you can't do anything. Kind of another one is, as Jordan mentioned, is that creeping sense of expansion. Slowly, contacts, allies, custos, and other mages are being turned on you. They lose interest in the revealed conspiracy as they are co-opted or turned.
Like, you find out that, like, your son is going to a school that is secretly a technocratic mind control operation, and you try to argue with your partner, like, not to bring him there, and they're like, oh, they think you're just being crazy. This is another one of your crazy theories. They're going to go, and there's nothing you can do.
And kind of the horror is either a sense of futility or a sense of ignorance, that if you had looked closer, you would have been able to realize this much sooner, and there may have been a more effective way to resist or what have you. The joy of Mage is this is something that we can reflect by a changing gauntlet rating, changing magic difficulties, whether or not something moves from coincidental to vulgar or not. And kind of one of the initial conversations that Jordan and I had with this was, what is it like on the inside versus the outside? If you're interested in taking this in another direction, Conspiracies can be used very much for humor if you want to be, because of how banal it is to maintain a conspiracy. And to me, this kind of lended itself to a natural hierarchy. The character are initially asked to do cleanup work, which may be literal, like, hey, can you go to this place and remove these bullet casings or something like that? Next, you need to see that a particular piece of mail isn't delivered. Then you need to make sure that a form is misfiled at City Hall. It may elevate then to you having to threaten minor bureaucrats or other people who may reveal it.
Literally a janitor.
Yeah.
Or you might literally be a janitor where it has to clean up after the super intelligent dolphins.
They don't have thumbs. It's the one thing that you can do to guarantee yourself a place.
Yeah.
This elevates to murder, treason, arson. But one of the interesting things you can do with this is you never need to reveal what the actual conspiracy is. So you never need to necessarily reveal who's on the inside and who's on the outside. Were these just pranks or loyalty tests or something else? Do you advance in the conspiratorial pyramid by saying that the conspiratorial pyramid is stupid? One of the things that cults will do is they ever increasingly raise the cost of leaving by forcing you to give up either more of yourself or making larger and larger public pronouncements that indicate a position. If maintaining the hidden nature of a conspiracy requires continually expanding the group to include others, maybe the consequences just kind of spiral out of control. This can certainly be a source of humor, and I could very much see this paranoia technocratic game that kind of leans on it. Or maybe your goal is to control some distant part of a conspiracy, that you are just the money front that funnels it into paying this network of janitors to clean up after the hyper-intelligent space dolphins.
Yeah, I do like the idea of, like, conspiratorial janitors who are part of a super conspiracy, but their actual, like, power is very low individually.
Yeah. And they may know a lot. They're just low in terms of actionability. They have very, I am familiar with how the Sacred Rebus is formed. I don't have access to the quantum computer that would be required to decode it, but yeah, I can tell you all about it.
Oh, yeah. Which leads to this idea of you trying to lead this, of, because everyone just blabs in front of the custodians, like no one's really paying attention to them. you trying to leave the conspiracy leads to them doing like an all-out assault against you, even though you're just a janitor, because they don't know. If someone says like, "What do they know?" Then the other person's like, "I don't know. We just talk in front of them all the time. Who pays attention to them? They
Yeah.
they might know the whole thing."
Or, and if you want to play on the other end, you're the person trying to liberate the janitor. You're the traditionalist that's trying
Yeah,
to, that like, this is the very
yeah.
high value target. This is the high level technocrat that's defecting.
It's Ahti from Control.
Yes. The other use I kind of saw for this was conspiracy as a form of paradox backlash. A character with quiet may see an expanding conspiracy. There's a symbol that, when near them, seems to interfere with their magic. Marta Trimagaze begins falling into quiet and feels the city of Pymander has been co-opted and begins seeing inverted triangles everywhere. As her quiet increases, they become more numerous. A character with particularly strong paradox backlash instantiates a paradox spirit that looks like a conspiracy. The Triangle Conspiracy Company doesn't exist until Backlash by paranormal investigator Clarice Stimson creates it. She is pursued by these dark agents who accost her of heresy against orthodoxy. The Nefandi spin up a grand conspiracy as a way to recruit new members. People desire to be on the inside. The Heptagram is an occult organization who litters America with iconography to suggest that they have a vast conspiracy implying great power. What it actually is an on-ramp to brainwash people to join by having them commit larger and larger crimes until they're not really able to leave.
Also, marauders.
What do you mean by that?
Like a marauder could have a quiet that's so like becomes so severe that within that quiet there is a conspiracy. Like it's sort of this weird traveling one that goes with them.
Yeah, wherever they are, there the Illuminati is as well.
Yeah.
You came up with a bunch of custom conspiracies for the World of Darkness. What are they?
This is a lower stakes one, but it still fits in that grand conspiracy. So it says I wrote the Blank Land Improvement Council. It's supposedly an organization set up to regulate how this one single natural park area is used. It's actually the newest version of a centuries old mage conspiracy set up to prevent public access to a precious node. And they will lie, cheat, and steal and blackmail and everything to keep you away from it. But it's just that one place.
And it's defended by a hungry unicorn.
Yes.
And that feeds into our cryptid option. It could create a fight across it, or it's being used to disrupt the flow of quintessence across a city. I always have land use management controlled by the Nefandi. That's just me.
Yeah.
What was your second one?
Oh, I like this is another like sort of humorous one, which is certain conspiracy theory subcultures having a single beleaguered assembly of the NWO, trying and failing to map them all together, all of the kind of conspiracy theories together to discern the unified occult truths that their distant manager insists has to exist.
Okay, so there's like 12 different weird occult conspiracies within a city, and your supervisor is like, figure out who's at the heart of this.
Bring me evidence of this conspiracy.
Yeah, so you're trying to be like, okay, tell me how the saucer people and the reverse vampires feed into each other.
And they will not take no for an answer.
Okay. So now this is a case where your group needs to fabricate necessarily,
Yes.
or whether or not it's there or not.
Create the conspiracy, or you need to make you need to literally make a giant flying saucer.
Got it. And then properly document it. Yes. This is beautiful. And your third?
It's like how the moon landing is fake, but Stanley Kubrick insisted on being a known perfectionist, insisted on filming it on location.
The video of the moon landing was falsified, but to make sure it looked correct, he did several trips to the moon to make sure everything was just right. Yes.
Another one is a small town has been controlled for ages by a council of supposedly impossibly old people who seem to have been able to blackmail or otherwise threaten the municipal officials and law enforcement into compliance for generations. Turns out to actually be a group of wraiths who have been using various arcanoi to control people in positions of influence. This could either be an antagonistic group, comfortable alliance, or if you have enough entropy, an easily exploitable resource.
Yeah, I like the fact that there is a single lich and everything, all the control of the town is just to cover up the fact that they are impossibly old. And this reminds me of the internet thing that goes around every once in a while of what are some things people believe about your area that aren't true. And it's a Romanian guy who's like, people say that there's vampires in this area, but I've lived in this town for over 500 years and I've never encountered a vampire. Yeah. I asked my landlord, who's over 1,000 years old, and he's never seen one either.
I think wraiths are actually like a really underrated way to do conspiracies because they can literally be anyone if they have possession, and they're very hard to spot unless you have very specific powers in World of Darkness. So it's sort of like, how could all these people be controlled at the same time? And they haven't met each other because they're being possessed by the same guy who can go through walls.
And kind of the last thing I have is conspiracies you can introduce into your game, because it makes sense that mages would have their own conspiracy theories about what's going on in the world around them. Charles Siegel proposed that Ascension and the 10th Sphere are just conspiracy theories. As I think Charles once said, remember, Ascension was just created by Big Ascension to sell more Ascension, in the same way that Pi Day was invented by math companies to sell more math.
Oh, it's like the metaverse. They won't even tell us what Ascension actually is.
Yeah. T.L. Webb. Hallel was actually just Lucifer's pawn. That's a deep cut for Demon the Fallen, which one day I may ultimately play.
On one level, you already have. One level of reality, you already have.
On one level of reality, I already have.
Nefandi have infiltrated the Bettini, thank you, Glamour Weaver, or the Bettini are actually mad, thank you, Graph. I say both.
Yes. You're like, yes, we can't possibly be compromised. That's a sign that you're compromised. The sphere system itself is a conspiracy created by the traditions with shared paradigms of Kabbalah and alchemy in common. It is an attempt to perform the great work of magic itself. Whether this is good or bad, failing or receding, and whether it's a double, triple, or quadruple agent is not fully specified. Disguiding this is both the joy of the game and the fun of unreliable narrators. Thank you, Princess Palm. One of the ones was that Neville, or Nev, is a technocratic agent, the founder of the Hollow Ones. It is a technocratic long con to undermine occult belief in deeper truths with postmodern materialism. I like the attack.
I like that.
That the Hollowers and like the Syndicate are like the two postmodern groups in Mage. Everyone can claim the mantle, but those are the two that naturally jump to mind for me. I always liked as an idea.
I like this one. All the supernaturals in World of Darkness are mages. They just have awakened in a different manner. The Curse of Cain and Clan Bane is just a permanent paradox. A kindred pay for the use of their powers, banality for changelings, and worm taint, Hirano frenzying for werewolves. By Kresh.
Yeah, and they all have avatars, and the moment they figure out that they're all basically the same thing, the veil between worlds will fall and everything will be great. And by that I mean things will be terrible, because from what I understand, the world before the Rise of the Gauntlet was a pretty harrowing place.
It'll be differently terrible, though.
Yeah, differently.
In a new and novel and interesting way.
Yeah.
This is an interesting, ties into like a joke, long-running joke I have, which is that there is only one human left in the World of Darkness. Everyone else are just supernaturals who are trying to stay secret from each other. And there's this one guy who's just like somehow in the dark.
Yeah, the one mortal left, and all Paradox is actually generated from Jim somewhere in Peoria.
It's not a depopulation, it's just billions of supernaturals.
Oh yeah, that's like when I hear about these LARP events where it's like a small town and they have 170 people in their LARP community. I'm like, so 5 out of every 4 people in your town is a vampire. That's good to know.
That's how every town has enough like vampires to actually. Have you seen the org chart on a Camarilla, Princedom? Crazy.
I also like the fact that both you and I go back and forth between calling it Camarilla and Camarilla.
Camarilla. Tobacco plants absorb paradox and attempts to spread it, or a technocrat plot by Halong.
I thought this one was super neat. Like, this was based on the idea that tobacco plants can absorb, I think, like heavy metals from soils or something like that. And the technocrats realize that this will absorb paradox. So, like, the spread to the New World or smoking tobacco around the world was just this attempt to allow them to safely expand their paradigm, but inadvertently created 80% of all cases of lung cancer in the process, and a number of other.
That's where the paradox is going.
That's where, Paradox killed my grandmother. I like the idea that there is a mundane thing that has actually been, that is hazardous, that has been advanced around the world. Another one that was really good at containing paradox, asbestos. Oops.
Yeah. Another example of a mundane thing that the technocrats, helped spread around the world that caused a lot of damage. The British Empire.
Yeah. Yes. Just as an aside, Ia Colin brings up, one, Oklahoma is just weird, and that we should have an episode just talking about the weird things that occur in Oklahoma. And I fully agree with this. He also brought up the interesting examples of non-conspiracies, of things that were purportedly conspiracies, but weren't. For instance, the Agent Orange experiments that occurred, I believe, on Dine Land, similar to the example I brought up of antibiotic test in Nigeria that was far from being above board.
Tuskegee as well. These things were awful. They really happened, but they weren't conspiracies.
In some way that they were. Usually it was a case of, what's the best way of putting it?
Yeah, I think often it's just a case of neglect and not really caring about the humanity of the people that were hurt. They didn't.
Yes, the person started out being neglectful and simply went with that, and then maybe had to do things to continue to conceal their own incompetence or the wrong that they had done.
The Anakim/Psychopalms from Manifesto, Transmissions from the Rogue Council are literally Chest the Demons from Demon the Fallen. That's from Sam. And finally, Rasputin is a insert supernatural here.
Yeah, Mage never really had a huge Rasputin connection. And I mean, he's listed, I think, as a hermetic because everyone is listed as a hermetic. I think we should all be comfortable with the fact that he's a mummy.
I think the final one, and I really liked it, was that he's a wraith and he just keeps possessing different supernaturals.
I can get behind that. I just wish there were more mummies running around, and that's generally the
Sure.
direction that I want to go. Kind of the last piece we have are some recommended media. When you think conspiracy and how to do one, what comes to mind for you?
There are so many great. So I think Delta Green is very far on the grim side. It starts as like a Call of Cthulhu sort of setting module for the early 90s when it came out. And it's since sort of branched off into its own thing. And it is a fantastic discussion of these, both the price of being in a conspiracy and the things that conspiracies can do. I think an important thing that they do in it is that the people behind it, it's always about like humans trying to sort of get at the Cthulhu mythos and find a way to profit from it in some sense.
Yep. Generally, you are Delta Green. You are the quote unquote good guys, that you're a black book agency that has maybe been defunded, but you're still co opting the resources that you still have access to.
Very big quotes around good guys.
Yes.
But yeah.
Often fighting Majestic, who wants to weaponize Cthulhu in some way, that they see the magics that Cthulhu worshippers are able to do and be like, imagine if we could use this against the Soviets.
There's been some changes since, but yeah, like that's generally it's like you're a conspiracy, you're a scrappy conspiracy fighting against the big conspiracy.
Other RPGs that kind of focus heavily on that, the Esoterrorists, which one day we will do an episode on, and an RPG that you are quite fond of, which is
Unknown Armies, which is it is the most postmodern game. It is basically a game where I mean, to describe it, I would actually look at the Mage the Podcast episode on Unknown Armies.
yes, which we got to do with Greg Stolze. So
No, but it's a fantastic one. I particularly love the sort of rumors bits that are in all of them that could create like a conspiracy and it's conspiracy theory in itself.
another one also that had been influenced is the game Over the Edge, which is a somewhat surreal role-playing game of conspiracies that takes place on the island of Alamarha, written by Jonathan Tweet and Robin Laws, published by Atlas Games. Don't Rest Your Head comes to mind. Feng Shui is a more action-oriented version of it. There's a lot of conspiracy games running around out there.
Pretty much any like supernatural game RPG that is set in modern times kind of requires a conspiratorial framework for you to explain like why everything else is normal except for the supernatural stuff.
Yup. Next would be works of fiction or purported works of fiction from our good friend Umberto Eco, and that is
Oh, Foucault's Pendulum. So I actually haven't read it, but I know that it's an important one. So it's more of like kind of the satire criticism of the grand conspiracy narrative. Like you never really know much about the conspiracy itself, aside from people who are already in it. It's more about the development of the characters to become more and more entrenched in belief in the conspiracy than whether any of the conspiracy is real or not.
I read this. Normally, I was at the age where people normally either read Tolkien or Ayn Rand, and instead I read Umberto Eco, and
It's the third option.
yes, I chose the road less traveled, too less traveled, but it's a chunky doorstop of a tome, and the idea behind it is a group of people kind of make up a conspiracy to prove how ridiculous grand conspiracies are, and they do it as this kind of intellectual game of being like, hey, how can I connect these two ideas? And then they slowly find out that it is real, or seems to be real. It is also the book from which I gained the knowledge of the term imponderable neometer. It tries to tie together every secret society that has ever existed, at least in Europe. It's pretty big, though. It's pretty big. So
But it's interesting that like it's not about actually like it wouldn't even be about is the technocracy real or not. It's about people reacting to is the technocracy real and what that does to people.
yes,
Like an agent could never even appear, would never even show up in that story.
yeah,
For
this is
example.
this is the book version of what if Bob Schnoblin were to write down his journey to create the Bob Schnoblin's Pyramid of Satanic Power.
And then at the end, like a vampire shows up and was like, "What the hell was all this?" After
Exactly.
like everyone's
Where'd you
died.
get this? Just that bloody room. What about in other media?
There was Inside Job that was on Netflix a couple of years back. It was canceled far too soon after only two seasons. It's about people living, basically existing within sort of the big grand conspiracy. It's not the Illuminati because they're specifically rivals with the Illuminati,
Okay.
but it's a much more comedic version of it. I really recommend it.
I was also a big fan of the video game Control, mostly because I tend not to
Yes.
watch a lot of television or movies in comparison, but I do play me a video game from time to time. And this is,
It was great.
yes, it also gives a bunch of interesting ideas of items that you could include in your game. It's very heavily inspired by SCP, the idea that there are weird objects with strange properties that could be highly destructive, and that there is an organization trying to figure out how to use them and neutralize them. The game lacks the kind of bureaucratic satire of SCP, where frequently these like low-level mooks are being killed by man-eating refrigerators or pinatas with a thirst for blood or what have you.
Yeah, just to test them.
Yeah, and we did an interview with the creator of Triangle Agency to talking about their game. One of the things that's interesting, though, is it talks about what it's like to uncover a conspiracy, explain it to other people, as well as what knowledge that reality is not what it seems kind of does to you. Control also does a good job of kind of explaining what a bunch of people on the inside of a conspiracy who may think that there is another conspiracy in the conspiracy may start doing. It also has a enjoyable combat system, and yeah, I think it's reasonably well done.
A lot of fun, sort of like live action videos. It can't recommend it enough.
Who doesn't like a quick time scene and a possible tie into the Alan Wake universe?
And of course, a great musical segment.
Yes, the ashtray sequence is quite good.
Of course, the X-Files is like the seminal one that like it really kind of changed how we interact with conspiracy fiction. It's sort of, I think, like the template for most conspiracy sort of fiction going forward.
It gave us the notion that you could have a mix of types of conspiracy, that there could be a grand conspiracy, and then there could be smaller ones kind of interspersed throughout it, what it's like to have double and triple agents and so on. And yeah, it really set the template for what attractive people investigating a conspiracy look like.
And interdepartmental conspiracies too, because like they're part of the FBI. They should be on the inside, but then there's like an outside to the inside.
Yes.
And finally, I think one noted is the various big quotes documentaries about, say, ancient aliens, alternate histories, things on the History Channel. I'm not saying that, they're clearly false, but if you want to just get a quick idea for like, I need a weird thing, I don't know, watch Ancient Aliens or something.
And generally for me, the question is, one, how do I subvert the trope of this invariably being either anti-Semitic or derogatory towards the technological advances of people that that have been subjugated by the global north? And how could I make this real in a way that would be interesting within the world of darkness? Like, what if our ancient aliens are actually vampires attempting to leave Earth to abandon the curse of Cain? I think that's kind of cool. Yeah. Well, Jordan, thank you so much for your time and kind of walking us through this pretty expansive thing. If people want to see what you're up to or get in contact with you, how do we do that?
You can find me on Discord as Mobstop Doy. Otherwise, I don't really do much social media. I honestly try to kind of stay off of it. Not for any interesting conspiratorial reason, just because it's not very good. But yeah, I'm always good to get pinged on Discord. And you can find me on the Mage the Podcast Discord at times.
Awesome. Jordan, thank you so much for your time.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me.
This has been Mage the Podcast, where the only grand conspiracy we have involves you, the listeners. The show is made possible by our executive producers, who include the oracles of the following conspiracies: Ben Bendelow, oracle of the conspiracy that pigeons are government surveillance drones and that they charge for overtime; Buck Gregory, oracle of the conspiracy that world leaders actually compete in secret dance-offs to settle global disputes; Christopher Phillips, oracle of the conspiracy that the Earth is actually just a hologram projected from the moon; Guy Stewart, oracle of the conspiracy that the dinosaurs went extinct because they were all drafted into intergalactic wars; Jay Widener, oracle of the conspiracy that all internet memes are actually created by a single 400-year-old monk; Joshua Hillerup, oracle of the conspiracy that the real reason for daylight savings time vampires; McHale, oracle of the conspiracy that Mercator projection is actually size accurate. All other projections are used to hide the true vastness of Greenland; Pukaji, oracle of the conspiracy that aliens built pyramids to spice up interstellar real estate sales; Sean Gallagher, oracle of the conspiracy that time travelers use Renaissance fairs as temporal gateways but are so confused on arrival as to appear mad; the crew of Erebus, oracle of the conspiracy that every sock lost in laundry is sent to a parallel universe to be used as currency, and the US dollar is actually lost socks from a different dimension; St. UX Player, oracle of the conspiracy that global warming isn't truly global and that there's one nice spot in central Spain that's always going to be just perfect; and Jason Vines, oracle of the conspiracy that the secret underwater internet cables are just giant communication network for the dolphins that lead the progenitors. Along with Archmaster Andrew Edelstein, Archmaster Brad the Blue, Archmaster Dan Svensson, Archmaster Derek Semsek, Archmaster Leroy Bryce, Archmaster Michael Parker, Archmaster Morgan Aran, Archmaster Nathan Weaver, Wolf Larison, Alex, Alexia, Ambiversion, Andrews S., Anon, Badurfi, Berto, Blaze Hibbert, Blake Ryan, Brandon, Bryce Perry, Bubba the Pale One, Chris Blake, Sinchotis, Daniel Cuppin, Daniel Scribner, Darren Hennessy, David Roy, Dennis Osborne, Eli Levenger, Eric Schwenk, Fragger Rock, George Lara, Gray Trilog H., Guy with Puns, Henry Kraft, Hugo the Bog Person, Ia Bowl, Jason Kennedy, Jason W. Briggs, Jay Gatsby, Jeff Bryn, Jen, Jervis Johnson, John Magnuson, Joel and Andes, Laws and Stuff, Kathleen Halperin, Chris Kinner, Leslie Weatherstone, Manel Canos, Matthew Proyle, Michael Creedle, Maurice Hopkins, Nibero, Neil Patterson, Nikita Klimanoff, Oliver Schindler, Patrick McNamara, Patrick Mulder, Pax Cow, Rachel Grace, Ricardo, Richard Bat Brewster, Robart the Robot, Ryan Stray, Rob H., Ryan Kendi, Samuel Tobin, Seven S's, Starfish, Steph Carton, Steve Wynyard, Thrice Great, Vincent Hamilton, Walter, William Conley, and William Martin. Our EP shout-out this episode is to Pax Cow, which reminds me of Pascal, the surname of Victor Pascal, one of the first characters to die in Stephen King's book Pet Sematary, whose soul then becomes entwined with another's after whispering to her a cryptic message on his deathbed that some men's hearts are stony. Later, he appears to warn of the deadfall at the back of the pet cemetery, which lay beyond the barrier and should not be violated. I like to think that if Pax Cow had the ability to come back as a ghost, they would use their powers to warn us of places man was not meant to go, and how meddling with the powers of life and death should simply not be done. Regardless, thank you for your support, Pax. If you'd rather listen on YouTube, search Mates the Podcast on YouTube to find our full library there. If you super like the episode or super didn't, drop us a line at matesthepodcast@gmail.com or at matesthepodcast on Twitter. We have a Hop and Discord community at discord.me/matesthepodcast. Mates the Podcast is also on Mastodon at dice.camp at Mates the Podcast. If you like us, please give us a review on the platform of your choosing or tell a friend about us. Also go to matesthepodcast.com for show notes and all of our previous shows. Now go change reality. Bye.